Hi, Jonathan Fassett here with Liberty University. Today we're talking about public history and how we're getting history out of academia and into the public view. Specifically today we're talking about architectural preservation. As you can see behind me, I'm standing in front of a fort that looks pretty old. I'm in St. Augustine, Florida. St. Augustine is the oldest continuously inhabited city in America. St. Augustine was inhabited first in 1565 when the Spanish arrived during the festival of St. Augustine, and they named the city St. Augustine. St. Augustine has been the capital of, well, at least it was the capital of Spanish Florida until the United States took it over. And this particular fort has existed in different iterations throughout its lifetime. Its preservation is extremely important, and by keeping it here, it is a huge draw for history for the general public, and this is regularly visited on a daily basis. This is the CastilloDeSanMarcos, and this fort was built in 1672, and like I said before, it existed in several different iterations before its current form. This particular fort was a wooden structure in its 9 previous iterations, and during the 1600s, in those previous iterations, the Queen of Spain intended for this to be a protection point for the Spanish treasure fleet as it sailed between the Caribbean and back to Spain. And how we got to use St. Augustine as that central point of protection was because of the Gulf Stream. The Gulf Stream is very close off of the state of Florida, and with that, the Spanish would use that to get to and from, back and forth from now the United States back to Spain. Because of its close proximity and the ship's close proximity to the coast, these treasure fleets were very vulnerable to pirates or to the British or whomever else was looking to take them on. So the Queen, the intention of the Spanish Empire was to put a military establishment here that could protect and provide support to those boats as they were going to and from. Now, the Spanish Empire had promised money and resources in order to build forts here in its previous iterations, and that never came to fruition, which resulted in only a simple wooden fort time after time. And these forts continued to fall for whatever reason, and finally, in 1668, some pirates came to St. Augustine and they wrecked the 9th iteration of this fort. They took over the town of St. Augustine for 24 hours. They killed about 60 Spanish. They ran the rest of the inhabitants into the woods, and they had prisoners for the night. What was really scary for the Spanish, though, was that the pirates didn't ransack the town. They left the town rather well off, and this was a wake-up call for Queen Mariana, who realized that they needed to do something. The idea that the belief was at the time that the pirates were going to come back and use this base as a base of operations and overtake the Spanish hold on this region. So in 1668, Queen Mariana employed Don Manuel de Sandoya to come build a fort here, to come build a stronghold to fix the problems and to put the money and resources into it and the manpower to protect what was their capital at the time here in St. Augustine. So on a Sunday afternoon in 1672, they broke ground here, and as you can see behind me, this wonderful construction project was started. This is actually the oldest masonry fort still in existence. This is the 10th iteration of a fort here in St. Augustine. And as you see behind me, this is a very unusual looking fort. It's built of coquina shell. Now, coquina is different because it's not just a very solid, brittle structure. It's just not a strong, rigid object. Coquina is actually a fossilized, compressed sand and shell that has become stone. Now, this structure, this compound, is actually very soft and leaky, and what that means is that since this is made of entirely coquina and it's soft and leaky, when it rains it rains inside just like it rains outside. Water just drips through and it will flood the place with a quickness. Now, there were some really good advantages which may not have been realized at the time. Because it was soft and leaky and not rigid, when it was attacked by cannon fire, the compound was very absorbent of the cannonballs that hit the sides of the fort, which didn't easily destroy the fort. It made it pretty much impregnable for the period. Now, some other very unusual things about this fort is that it is a multi-level fort, and that is common for the area. But however, this fort has 4 diamond-shaped bastions on each corner that extend beyond what would have been the typical perimeter of the fort. Now, these diamond-shaped bastions are unique because if a crew was standing on each bastion, they would have 360-degree sight security around the fort, which meant that nobody could sneak up on it. Now, beyond just the bastions, these were very large bastions, and they provided ample room for cannons for a defense or offensive, given whatever situation is happening. This fort had room for 70 cannons. These cannons consisted primarily of average period cannons. They were 16-pounder, 18-pounder, and 24-pounder cannons. Of these times, of course, when I say pounder, I mean that's the size of the cannonball. These cannonballs were typically loaded with half that of gunpowder at the time, which meant a 24-pounder would be loaded with 12 pounds of gunpowder. So you can just imagine all of these cannons loaded up, ready to go, and the Spanish releasing, 50, 60 cannons. How loud a battle here would be during the period. Now, beyond just the shape of this fort, it has a very rich history, and besides just its construction. And that's another very important aspect to public history. This fort, from its creation in 1672 all the way through 1812, has been a point of contention. And this fort has never been successfully sieged and taken. This fort, as it stands today, is undefeated. It survived 3 major sieges. The first siege was in 1702, when the British sailed from Charleston, which was a newer established port up there. They sailed down from Charleston, and they laid siege here for 51 days before being defeated. And again in 1740, this time the British came from Georgia on land, and they attacked from the north that particular time. And again, because of the shape of these bastions, they were able to have 365-degree security again. And because these bastions were so large, they were able to put multiple cannon rounds even inland to protect the fort here. So with the British in 1740, they failed. But again, in 1812, well, the British had learned their lesson, but the Americans were going to try their luck. The Americans this time in 1812 came down from Georgia again, and Americans doing what Americans do best. We went far and above the previous attacks, and we, as Americans, apparently laid siege here for 6 months. For 6 months, no avail. The fort still stood, and the Americans had to call off the siege of the Castillo. This fort has also a very unique history because it held Native Americans after Americans took over Florida during the Trail of Tears. The Native Americans were held captive here. So if we look at the structure behind us, we can think to ourselves that the Spanish Empire controlled this structure. The United States controlled this structure. Native Americans were affected and impacted by this structure, and again, this is the largest masonry fort that is in existence in the oldest continuously inhabited city in America. So this fort has a very, very large importance to history and to public history, and preserving it like the National Park Service does on a regular basis is a very large draw for the public to come out. They do a great job with it. Another way that the National Park Service reaches out to the general public to really press the importance and prominence of this fort is on the weekends, Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays. They will fire off cannon fire so the public can see just how loud it is out here. Besides that, this fort is just a wonderful piece of history, and I think that the general public can get a lot out of history, their own history, and this fort here has visitors from all around the world still coming today to see it. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next week.